It was supposed to be the safest night of her life. A wedding day ends the same way every fairy tale promises. Love secured, vows exchanged, a future sealed with hope. Surrounded by family, laughter, music, and children running through the house, everything looks exactly the way it should. No one imagines that danger could be waiting just upstairs. No one believes that the greatest threat could be the person standing beside the bride in every photograph. But sometimes, the moment a door closes, everything changes. What happens when a lifetime of struggle finally gives way to happiness, only for that happiness to last a matter of hours? What if the dream a woman fights so hard to build becomes the setting of her final moments? And how does a celebration filled with love turn into a crime scene soaked in blood before the night is over? This is not a story about strangers or shadows in the dark. It's about trust, about warning signs that seem harmless until it's too late, about jealousy mistaken for passion, and about a woman who believed she had finally found safety on the very day it was taken from her. Tonight, we step inside a wedding that ended in tragedy, a marriage that lasted only hours, and a truth so disturbing it forces one haunting question. How does a promise of forever become a death sentence before sunrise? The morning of Tina Antwistle's wedding felt like the closing chapter of a long, difficult journey. She was 30 years old, a single mother who had weathered more than her share of hardship, and this day represented something she had earned the hard way. For years, Tina had been strong out of necessity. She had survived an abusive childhood, unstable relationships, and the constant pressure of raising children largely on her own. Love, when it appeared, often came with pain attached. So when she finally allowed herself to believe in something gentle and steady, it felt almost miraculous. In Port Jervis, New York, the small town where she rebuilt her life, Tina was surrounded by people who knew her well. This was not a place where neighbors were strangers. People watched out for one another. They knew each other's kids, their routines, their stories. Tina fit into that fabric naturally. She was warm, outspoken, generous to a fault. Her home was always full of family, friends, food, noise, and laughter. Tina didn't just host people, she gathered them. The man she was marrying that day was someone everyone already knew. Dele had lived next door. Their relationship didn't begin with fireworks or drama, but with something quieter, familiarity. He helped her shovel snow, carry garbage cans, fix small things around the house. Tina didn't ask for help easily. Independence was something she clung to fiercely. But Louis was patient. He didn't push. He showed up. What mattered most to Tina were her children. Any man who wanted a place in her life had to accept that reality completely. Louis did more than accept it. He embraced it. He played with them, took them out, showed up consistently. He didn't treat them like an obligation. He treated them like family. That alone made Tina pause. Good men were rare in her experience. A man who was kind to her children felt even rarer. Slowly, cautiously, she let him in. Friends and family noticed the change in her. Tina laughed more. She relaxed in ways she hadn't before. She allowed herself to imagine stability, partnership, and a future that didn't revolve solely around survival. When Louis proposed, it felt less like a surprise and more like a confirmation of what Tina had already begun to believe, that this time she had chosen well. The wedding itself was simple, intimate, and deeply personal. Tina didn't want extravagance. She wanted meaning. She chose a champagne pink dress instead of white, a quiet nod to tradition without pretending to be something she wasn't. She made decorations by hand with her sisters. Bottles were painted, centerpieces crafted, laughter spilling across long nights of preparation. Every detail carried her fingerprints. When she walked down the aisle, she was radiant. People noticed it immediately. This wasn't nerves. This was joy. She cried as she said her vows, overwhelmed not by fear, but by relief. Relief that after everything she had arrived at this moment. Relief that she was no longer alone. The ceremony ended in smiles, applause, and photographs that would later feel almost unbearable to look at. The reception was exactly what Tina wanted. Music from different cultures, kids running through the room, family talking over one another, food being passed around freely. It wasn't polished. It was alive. And beneath all of it, there was nothing to suggest what was coming. There were no screams yet, no flashing lights, no blood, just a bride who didn't want the night to end, who invited everyone back to her house to keep celebrating. Music played. People laughed, wine bottles emptied. The house felt full in every sense of the word. If there were small moments of tension, they blended easily into the background. A look here, a comment there, Nothing that seemed dangerous. Nothing that suggested the love story unfolding that day would collapse before sunrise. Tina had spent her life learning how to survive pain. On her wedding day, she believed she had finally outlived it. She didn't know that within hours, the same house filled with laughter would become silent. That her children would sleep through the end of her life. That the man she trusted to protect her would be the last person she would face. And that the promise of forever would expire before the night was over. As the night stretched on, no one sensed how quickly the atmosphere inside Tina's home was shifting. The celebration spilled naturally from the reception hall back to the house, not out of recklessness, but because Tina was glowing. She didn't want the joy to stop. Music played in different rooms, kids dozed on couches, friends talked over one another, laughing, teasing, sharing food. It felt like one of those nights people remember for years, the kind that blends warmth, noise, and exhaustion into something comforting. But beneath the surface, something had begun to crack. Lewis had been watching Tina closely. What looked harmless to everyone else didn't feel harmless to him. A joke, a conversation. Tina playfully trying to set up a friend with one of his relatives. It wasn't betrayal. It wasn't inappropriate. It was Tina being Tina, social, generous, always thinking about others. But jealousy doesn't need logic. It feeds on perception, not reality. Lewis grew quiet. His mood shifted. Tina noticed it the way she always did. She had learned long ago how to read emotional weather. She had talked men down before. She believed this was just another moment that needed space and privacy. Not a crisis, just a conversation. She suggested they go upstairs. To anyone watching, it looked ordinary. Newlyweds slipping away from a noisy crowd. No raised voices, no alarm. The bedroom door closed behind them, muffling the music below. Guests stayed where they were, unaware that what was happening upstairs was already crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Inside the room, the argument intensified quickly. This wasn't about logistics or stress or fatigue. It was personal, accusatory, fueled by wounded pride and control. Tina, strong and outspoken as always, didn't shrink. She never had. She stood her ground. She reminded him whose house this was. She told him to leave if that's what he wanted. That defiance mattered. For someone whose jealousy was rooted in possession, hearing that he could be dismissed, especially on a night meant to symbolize unity, was unbearable. Words turned sharp. The air turned heavy. Somewhere in that escalation, the argument stopped being about feelings and became about power. Downstairs, the music kept playing. Then came the sounds no one could explain. Thuds, banging, something falling. A sister felt it first, that instinctive dread that bypasses reason. She went to the bedroom door, tried the handle. It was locked. Tina never locked doors. That alone set off panic. She knocked, no answer. She knocked harder, called Tina's name. Silence. When the door finally opened, the scene inside didn't make sense at first. Blood was everywhere. Tina was on the floor, her wedding dress soaked through, torn by wounds that spoke of desperation and terror. The room was chaos. Broken glass, overturned furniture, red smears on walls that had been decorated for a celebration just hours earlier. Someone was holding a knife. In that moment, confusion ruled everything. People screamed, someone ran, someone chased. Lewis's brother fled into the darkness. Lewis himself was injured, bleeding, disoriented. At some point, he fell, or jumped, from a second-story window, landing outside in a crumpled heap. Neighbors poured into the street. Sirens cut through the night. Blue and red lights washed over the small white house at the end of the block, transforming it into something unrecognizable. Inside, Tina was still alive. Barely. Emergency responders rushed in, but there was only so much they could do. The wounds were extensive. Defensive cuts told the story her voice no longer could. She had fought. She had tried to protect herself. She had tried to survive. Her newborn daughter slept nearby in her crib, unaware that her mother was dying just feet away. Family members were pulled back, forced to leave the room. One last touch. One last promise whispered through tears. Tina had never liked being alone, and now she was surrounded by strangers as her strength faded. She died less than 10 hours after saying, "I do." The house that had echoed with laughter was suddenly silent. The celebration was over. The marriage was over. Tina's life was over. And the question that would haunt everyone from that night forward was devastatingly simple. How did love turn lethal so fast? In the hours that followed, Shock gave way to questions, and questions quickly narrowed toward one man. Lewis was taken to the hospital under guard. His injuries were treated, but his wife was already beyond help. When detectives told him Tina had died, his response was chillingly restrained. No collapse, no visible disbelief, just a quiet acknowledgement that struck investigators as deeply unnatural given what had just happened. Grief, when it's real, usually breaks through. This didn't. Police began reconstructing the final minutes upstairs. The physical evidence spoke clearly, even when the stories did not. Tina had been stabbed repeatedly, in multiple locations, including her face, chest, back, and abdomen. These were not wild, panicked motions. They were forceful, deliberate, sustained. Defensive wounds on her hands and arms told investigators she had fought desperately, trying to block blows, trying to stay alive. This wasn't a single moment of rage. It was an attack that continued long after the outcome was inevitable. Lewis's first explanation raised immediate red flags. He claimed Tina had been cruel to him, that her words had cut deeply, that she had humiliated him. He suggested she pulled a knife first, that he was only defending himself. He minimized the violence, saying he stabbed her twice, framing it as a tragic accident spiraled out of control. But the scene didn't support that version. 2 stab wounds don't cover a bedroom in blood. 2 stab wounds don't leave injuries across the body. 2 stab wounds don't explain the intensity of what responders found. The medical examiner's findings were blunt. The sheer number and placement of wounds indicated an intent to kill. As investigators pressed further, Lewis's narrative began to shift. He admitted the argument was about jealousy. He admitted he was angry. He admitted he had grabbed the knife. Witnesses downstairs confirmed there had been tension earlier in the night, subtle but real. Tina had always been social, affectionate, warm with everyone. What others saw as friendliness, Lewis interpreted as threat. That mindset mattered. Jealousy on its own isn't rare, but jealousy mixed with entitlement and fear of abandonment can become lethal, especially when the person experiencing it believes they are losing control. Tina had done something profoundly dangerous in that moment. She asserted independence. She told him to leave. She rejected the idea that marriage meant ownership. For someone who equated love with possession, that rejection wasn't just emotional. It was existential. The timeline became clearer. The argument escalated. Tina removed her ring. She threw it down. She told him to get out. That single act symbolized everything Lewis couldn't tolerate. Loss of authority, loss of image, loss of control. The knife came out. Tina tried to de-escalate, reminding him of the children, of the baby asleep in the crib. But logic doesn't reach someone who has already crossed the psychological line into violence. What followed was not mutual combat. It was an assault. When family members burst into the room, the damage was already done. Lewis fled through the bathroom window, abandoning Tina where she lay. Others struggled briefly over the knife. Chaos filled the house. But the truth was already written in blood. Lewis was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. In court, the contrast between the wedding photos and the crime scene was unbearable. A bride smiling in champagne pink, a groom dancing with pride. Then autopsy reports detailing dozens of wounds. The fairy tale collapsed into something grotesque and irreversible. At sentencing, Lewis pleaded guilty. He claimed he never meant to kill Tina, that he lost control, that he didn't remember everything. But intention isn't measured by words after the fact. It's measured by actions in the moment. And his actions told a clear story. Tina's family sat through every hearing, carrying a grief that words couldn't touch. Their anger wasn't just about the violence, it was about betrayal. Tina had trusted him. She had believed she was finally safe. She had chosen him not just for herself, but for her children. That trust had been weaponized against her. Lewis received a sentence of 20 years to life. For the legal system, it was resolution. For the family, it was only an ending of one chapter. Tina's children would grow up without her. Her newborn daughter would never know her voice. Her siblings would replay that night endlessly, wondering what sign they missed, what moment could have changed everything. And the question that lingered long after the courtroom emptied was the most painful one of all. How many warnings did love disguise as normal until it was too late?
Tina Antwistle's story doesn't end with a sentence being handed down in a courtroom.
For her family, justice didn't bring peace. It brought a kind of stillness, the heavy quiet that follows a storm when everything familiar has been torn apart. Life moved forward, but nothing ever felt the same again. Her children were forced to grow up carrying a loss they were too young to understand. One child lost a mother they could remember. Another lost a mother they would only ever know through photographs, stories, and the memories of others. Birthdays, graduations, ordinary moments, each milestone carried an absence that could never be filled. Tina wasn't just taken from her family. She was taken from a future she had worked so hard to build.
What makes this case especially haunting is how ordinary it looked from the outside.
There were no police calls before the wedding, no history of documented abuse, no dramatic warning signs that screamed danger. Friends saw love, family saw happiness, neighbors saw a quiet couple raising children. And that's exactly why this case matters. Because violence like this rarely announces itself clearly. It often hides behind charm, behind apologies, behind jealousy disguised as love, behind the idea that passion equals devotion. Tina's story exposes a hard truth. Danger doesn't always look dangerous until the moment it's too late. Jealousy is frequently minimized, laughed off, or even romanticized. But extreme jealousy is not love. It's control, it's fear, it's entitlement. And when someone believes they are owed another person's loyalty, attention, or obedience, rejection can feel like annihilation. That's when violence becomes possible. Tina did something brave in her final moments. She stood up for herself. She asserted her right to say no. She told him to leave. Those actions weren't mistakes. They were strength. The tragedy is that strength sometimes provokes the very danger it tries to escape. For survivors watching this story, there is an uncomfortable recognition. Many people see pieces of their own relationships reflected here. The controlling comments, the possessiveness, the way arguments escalate faster than they should, the feeling of walking on eggshells to keep the peace. These are not small things. They are signals. Tina's life reminds us that love should never require fear. Marriage should never mean surrendering your voice. And no one ever causes someone else to become violent by setting boundaries. Lewis will spend decades in prison. Tina's family will spend decades carrying her absence. That imbalance is the cruel reality of violent crime. A single act lasts a lifetime for everyone left behind. But telling Tina's story isn't only about tragedy. It's about awareness. It's about naming the patterns that are too often ignored until they explode into irreversible harm. It's about honoring a woman who survived a violent childhood, built a life for her children, believed in love again, and paid the ultimate price for trusting the wrong person. If there's one thing to take from this case, it's this. Pay attention to behavior, not promises. Pay attention to control disguised as care. Pay attention to the moments that make you feel smaller, quieter, or afraid to speak. Those moments matter. And if you're watching this and recognize yourself in Tina's story, or in the warning signs around her, know this. Help exists, and your life is worth protecting. Love should never cost you your safety. If this story moved you, share it. Stories like Tina's don't change the past, but they can change the future by helping someone recognize danger before it becomes fatal. If you want more in-depth, carefully researched true crime stories that go beyond headlines and focus on the human cost behind the crimes, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay with us. Your support helps keep these stories told and keeps the victims remembered. Because remembering Tina Antwistle isn't just about how she died, it's about who she was and making sure her story still has the power to save lives.